I wish I would bring you good news from France in the field of the relations of the Muslim world with laïcité or secularism. It is not the case. It is not the case. The news are not that good. When I started wrapping up my ideas on this issue, I realized my own articles in Google gave me a title of an article I had written approximately 20 years ago, whose title was The Two Secularism, Les Deux Laïcités. And I had been responding to a precise question by a journal asking me, why is it that the word laïcité is so positive in the French language, and if you translate in Arabic, al-ilmaniyun, it's not so nice. It can almost be an insult. So I went into it, and I very soon got to the point of realizing that laïcité, this tool of ilmaniya in the Muslim world, is referred to the colonial period. It is in the name of laïcité that the Islamic legal order has been contained, restricted from the public, expelled from the public sphere to the private sphere. So when a Muslim citizen would hear laïcité or secularism, he would connect it with an attitude of the colonial power hostile to his symbolic system. But the strange side of the story is that nowadays, if you turn on your radio or your TV on prime time in France, if you hear the word laïcité, be prepared. Within seconds, explicitly or not explicitly, there will be the word Islam. There will be the menace of Islam. So again, in a totally different context, laïcité nowadays is connected with the idea of a total antagonism with Islam. In fact, if we go into more details, we need to understand what is the situation of secularism, what role it plays now in France. We need to go a little deeper in history. 2 minutes ago, you know, I am of these bad participants who stay connected when the other speakers speak. And someone from Turkey, in fact, sent me the title of an article which has just been published by The Economist. And the title is, the British and the Americans have a different treatment of Islam of the French. The British, the UK, and the US, they have some kind of pragmatism at a time when the French, they have only zeal. They are very nervous and they are very emotional. What is the historical reason? The historical reason is that of the French Revolution, which is very specific. The French Revolution had to take into consideration the fact that the church, if not the entire religion, was a close ally to the monarchy. So the revolution in France, and this is different, of course, in the UK, had to go against the church and to a certain extent against the religion in the process of creating a republican political system. And this has existed for long. So this we need to understand, at least not the hardcore of the position of a majority of French, but their discourse. When they say, we do not want any religion in the public sphere. It means, you know, it's something we have built. We created the republic after defeating the religion, or at least the church, okay? Moving the religion out of the public sphere. But then, as I mentioned in my previous remark, laïcité, this tool of preventing the religion to be active in the public sphere has been used as a tool for colonizers. During colonization, it is in the name of laïcité that we have said to Muslims throughout the area, Egypt or the Maghreb, your symbolic system, link it to your religion as to move away from the public sphere. We will allow it to be efficient in the not even in the salon, but in the sleeping room for private relations. Okay? So this has been a second expression of secularism in the contemporary history of France. Now the third one is the one I have to address now. The situation of secularism now is very strange. If I make it short, I will say the most secularists are betraying the idea of secularism and instrumentalizing it against a specific religion. As I said, when you hear the word laïcité in France today, it means that very soon those who defend laïcité, those who protect laïcité, they have one specific religion in mind, not the Catholic religion, not the Christian religion, and not even the Jewish religion, because you could find lines of tension between the Jewish religion. They are not on the agenda. On the agenda, you find the idea that any public appearance or any signal of belonging to the Muslim religion is illegitimate in the French landscape. And at the same time, those Abtal al-Ilmaniya, those heroes of laïcité, they mention the roots, Christian roots of France. The Christian roots come over and over. What does it mean? Christian roots. So when it comes to the paper we have heard this morning, I said how comfortable I was when I listened to them. I would add a little from an outsider point of view. Yes, sectarianism is a tool in the hand of the dominants. And I could add a lot of examples from my, if I may say, my Yemen, since I lived 6 years there. In Yemen, it is the archetype. Ali Abdullah Saleh is the one who has instrumentalized Ta'ifiyya in one side. Then on the other side, I will just give one example which might have fit in the paper of Nadir Hashami. In 2006, as he said, the Shia leadership was the most popular among the Sunni Arab. But he didn't say why, because Hezbollah had just almost militarily defeated Israel in the 2006 war. But immediately, the same year, December 2006, in Yemen, you have leaflets circulated saying, hey, would you kindly take into consideration the fact that those who have just executed Saddam Hussein, and Saddam Hussein was referred to as Assad al-Sunnah. Why? I mean, you know, Saddam Hussein was not precisely the symbol of Sunni belonging, but he was referred to as the lion of the Sunnah. And would you please take into consideration that those who have executed the Sunni leader, they are Shia. So the regime was becoming afraid of the popularity of Hezbollah, so he was trying to inject, although he was himself Shia, he was using the Ta'ifiyya rhetoric to demonize the Shia. But what I wanted to add from an outsider point of view is that Arab Spring has not only fueled the process, as Ahmed very well said this morning, when the national link, I am no longer a Syrian. What am I going to be? I am going to be either a Sunni or a Shia. I would add only one point. It is not only the religious belonging which benefits from the weakening of the national state. It can be the tribal, like it has in Iraq. It can be also the ethnic, like it has been in Syria. I'm no longer a Syrian, I might be a Kurd. I'm not only a Sunni or a Shia. But the most important, in my point of view, of what I wanted to add, is that this Ta'ifiyya has not been linked to the Muslim world only. Outside the Muslim world, there's been a process of sectarianization of the political belongings. The Euro foreign policy has again been a Christian-oriented foreign policy. My country, the champion for laicity, when it came to the point to whom should we give visas for the Iraqi refugees, all of a sudden we discovered that there was a priority for the Christians. What is it if not sectarianism? What is it if not that the country which was supposedly the defender of secularism, no connection with any public policy, with the religious belonging, they started acting as Christians. So I would say most of what has been said this morning does not apply only to the Muslim world. It applies to the West. It applies to the dominance. The dominance inject the poison of ta'ifiyya whenever it can be useful to them, whether ruling elites or elites who want to become ruling elites. And you know, the process which is going on in France nowadays is a process, and I am right in the middle of what I want to say, is a process of sectarianism. And we are not in the Muslim world. So all of what has been said on ruling elites in the Middle East should apply to any ruling elite on the surface of the globe. So what is the situation nowadays? There are so many examples in France, but let's say this survey which has been presented to the President of the Republic recently, and the problem is that he who wrote the survey, his name is not Marcel Dupont or Jean Laforêt. No, it's Hakim El-Qarawi. Because one of our specificity in France is we have Muslim voice express what the anti-Muslim feeling wants to hear. One of the specificity of the dysfunctioning of secularism, of secularism overflowing into the field of the respect of every community is the fact that we create fake Muslim elites. Our specialty in France since the colonial order is to create elites which are not representing more than 3% of the people they are supposedly speaking in the name of. So we have this report. I'm very proud of this report because I am personally mentioned in it, you know, as an Islamo-gauchiste. It's when you want to be very nasty to someone in France, you label him Islamo-gauchiste, Islamo-leftist. And if you go, they know who I am. Hey, here he comes. I have a few responses for you. If you go into Le Figaro, like I think 3 weeks ago, there is a picture of the explanation of the report of Hakim El-Qarawi. Hakim El-Qarawi knows how to deal with Muslims because he was the personal advisor of Zine Abidin Ben Ali until the very last day. He's the one who gave him the last advice 2 hours before he left Tunis. But Hakim El-Qarawi puts me in the frame. I am the only non-Muslim on the side of a young lady. I don't know if you know this young lady, Menel. Does the word Menel mean something? She's a young Franco-Syrian singer who appeared in one of these télé-réalité programs and had such an incredible voice that she came first, but she had some kind of, you know, this over her head. This was too much for not the right wing in France, for 60% of public opinion. She had a hijab. It's a very small hijab that the Iranians would label bald hijab, you know. Very light hijab. This was too much. So she had to quit the competition. So on the side of Menel, there are those who have spoken in favor before the affair of Taraq Ramadan, and I'm the only one. So the report, the red line in France nowadays define what is a good Muslim and what is not a good Muslim. I'm not a Muslim, but I'm the side of the bad Muslim. I am a representative of the bad Muslim, okay? But this report criminalizes Daesh, and I support this report. It's all right with me to criminalize Daesh, but it also criminalizes the entire Salafi trend. I keep saying, you know, a monk, a Christian monk, he prays 24 hours a day, is a radical in his religion, is not necessarily a warrior. But they criminalize the entire Ikhwan Muslimin, Muslim Brotherhood trend, with no exception. But not only, they criminalize, in the name of secularism, they criminalize, you might not be familiar, but there are associations defending, I have 3 minutes, Two. Well, they criminalize, including me. So, you know, this is why when I was interrogated by a commission in front of the French Senate, I used this sentence, which has been buzzing a little. But secularism nowadays in France, the criteria expressed at the highest level of the state, including an advisor for the President of the Republic, consider that the good Muslim is a Muslim who is no longer a Muslim. And this is the situation where more or less we are. And when this morning, again, I was on my computer and I read a kind of alarm. 2 journalists in Le Monde are just on the verge of publishing a huge inquiry on the radicalization of the French suburbs. And the guy who quoted this article say, oh, alarm number 5, red line. There would be a flame of sectarianism, again, in the name of secularism. This is our challenge. There is people resisting, don't be afraid, but nowadays, the balance of forces is not in our favor. Thank you so much.
Now that everybody's comfortably settled, let me reintroduce Dr. Burgat. He is a political scientist and Arabist, as well as a senior research fellow at the French National Center for Scientific Research. And as his research evidences, I mean, he's spent quite a bit of time in the Middle East. Says 24 years here, Algeria, Cairo, and Sana'a, and it looks like his latest book was translated into English in 2018, this year. I don't know the English title, but the French title is Comprendre l'Islam politique. So thank you very much. Now we move on to Omer Tasgetiren. He's an assistant professor here, so I guess many of you know him. So in the Political Science and International Relations Department. His dissertation at Georgia State University was Rethinking Turkish Laicism in Light of the Debates about Liberal Neutrality. And his talk today is entitled The Secularism Debate in the Muslim World, Lessons from Turkey. Thank you.
Thank you. How can I access to the PowerPoint? Can someone help about? Okay. Okay, thank you very much. I would like to thank first Professor Sami Aryan, the CIGA staff, and all the student volunteers, and including all the students. It is good to see a lot of students today from our Political Science and International Relations Department. My presentation the title is The Secularism Debate in the Muslim World, The Lessons from Turkey. Basically, the debate about the secularism is whether it is possible in the Muslim world, can there be a secularism in Muslim societies, and it is normatively desirable. That is also another question. And in that regard, I address 3 questions in my presentation. First is, how was secularism defended in Turkey? The second one is, do defenses of the secularism stand up to scrutiny? And finally, what does the AKP's policies, the current ruling government who has been ruling Turkey for the last 16 years, what does it say about secularism? Can secularism travel to in a Muslim society? Can something like that we see? Turkey, actually, Dr. Francois prepared the necessary foundation for my talk, because he talked about the problem with the laicite, and Turkey is an example of how a laicite, an aggressive version of secularism, is implemented in a Muslim society, and the problems that emerged as a result of that. First of all, to give a brief background about laicism in Turkey, or secularism in Turkey. Secularism was an essential element of the authoritarian modernization of the Turkey. Basically, as we all know, Turkey's example of modernization is an authoritarian modernization. The decisions about how Turkey should proceed, what kind of a system Turkey should adopt, decided by political elites and imposed to the rest of the society. And secularism was a defining aspect of the new identity the political rulers of the Turkey wanted to promote. And for that purpose, we see the addition of the article about principle of secularism to the Turkey's constitution in 1937, and subsequently, in all the constitutions of the Turkey, the principle of secularism is a non-amendable article of the Turkey's constitution. And in that regard, that means Turkey embodies a concept of militant democracy, because the non-amendable of the article, the fact that it is non-amendable, means that no majority can propose to change that article of the Constitution. And the militant democracy as a concept, meaning that the democracy has a right to defend itself against internal attacks, internal criticisms. And for implementing the concept of militant democracy, we see the banning out of political parties, Islamic political parties, primarily the so-called National Outlook movement, founded by Necmettin Erbakan, all of them going back to the 1970s. All of them were banned by Turkey's constitutional court, and final version was the Refah Welfare Party and then the Virtue Party. Also, even just 10 years ago, we see the opening of a closure case against the ruling AKP, which is and in that case, the Constitutional Court regarding the AKP in 2008 did not close the party, but still said that AKP represents a threat to the secularism in Turkey. According to the exact usage, they said that AKP became a center of anti-secular activities in Turkey, and this is why it should be punished, and the punishment was deprivation of the AKP from the financial assistance coming from the treasury. So this concept is very important, secularism and the militant democracy, to understand Turkish politics, and it really shapes the relations, the power relations in the Turkish politics. How secularism is interpreted by the Constitutional Court, if you want to answer that question. Secularism is not just a principle about regulating politics in Turkey. It is as according to the Constitutional Court of Turkey, it's a civilized way of life. Or the Constitutional Court says it is a Turkey's philosophy of life. So that shows that the reference to the civilized way of life, a reference to the way of life, shows that it is not just a principle regulating how the politicians talk in the public sphere, but rather an all-encompassing category which regulates the relations, which imposes a certain lifestyle to the population, even living in the private sphere. And the court espouses a certain progressive conception of history, and the justification comes from that the religion belongs to the earlier parts of the history, but with the rise of science and rationality, it replaces the religion, and this is why what we are having, or what the Kemalism brings to the Turkey, or what the secularism, application of secularism means in the case of Turkey, is that it's basically leading the Turkey to the most progressive era. And you see in the Constitutional Court's interpretation, all these references to all the ideas such as replacement of the dogma in the case of Turkey and Islam, replacement of the dogma with the rationality, the concept of the servant of God with the individual, the concept of the Ummah with the nation. So the secularism aims to, in Turkey, displace all these concepts. Another point is the secularism is the precondition of democracy, and that is how the whole justification for banning political parties come from. Refah parties should be closed, the welfare party should be closed, or other political parties should be closed because they pose a threat to the democracy, and democracy means secularism. There is no liberal or a non-secular version of democracy. And the opposite of that, the religion-based states never guarantee basic rights and liberties. These are all you see if you read the Constitutional Court's decisions about the Welfare Party or the AKP or the headscarf issue. So let's explore this question. Is secularism a precondition of democracy? Does this argument stand up to scrutiny in the case of Turkey? Kemalism as an ideology, as we know, established its rule during the one-party regime. And after the transition to democracy, in the case of Turkey, as a fact, we know that Kemalist parties were not that successful. They don't fare well in the elections in Turkey since the 1950s and until 2018. Generally, as a general comment made by political scientists writing on Turkey, they say that the Turkish political scene is dominated by center-right parties or some sort of Islamic, a mixture of Islam and center-right parties are more accommodative of the Islamic principles. So in a sense, Kemalism did not survive through the ballot box in Turkey. Kemalism lost in the ballot box, but it survived, or it maintained its hegemony with respect to two major institutions, which are one of the Turkish Constitutional Court, and the second one is the Turkish army. So the juristocracy, Turkish juristocracy helped maintain the Kemalist hegemony. Also the Turkish army through the intervention in the politics and rewriting the rules of the game. And we should also keep in mind, we should remember that all the constitutions of Turkey have been written after military interventions, after the 1960 or after the 1980. So despite secularism correlation with authoritarianism and military interventions, it is still a very common discourse to say that secularism is a precondition of democracy in the Muslim world. And it is still used, not only in Turkey, in other countries. The recent example I would say is Egypt. The overthrow of the Mursi by the army is also justified with reference to secularism. I disagree with that perspective in these countries where Islam matters as a religion, as a way of life for people. And when the democratic process reflects the concerns and the interests of those Muslim communities, one way or another, the political parties try to represent the values of the religious Muslims. And I would say that such a discourse, the discourse that secularism is a precondition of democracy, often masks the violence of the secular regimes, and it allows the rule of the few over the many. Another issue that I want to discuss, and this has to do a little bit about political theory, literature, lawmaking under a secular state. The general description, as I say, the general argument of the secularists in Turkey, the Kemalists in Turkey, is that religious states violates people's freedom of conscience by imposing religious values that they don't endorse. So religious states are undemocratic, they oppress people, they lead to totalitarian, even the Constitutional Court uses this term. But what about the secular state? We need to also explore the law-making under a secular state. That is one of the issues that may perhaps I differ from some other panelists and perspectives. It is not just for me the issue of the French laïcité that is the problem that we always easily criticize. Rather, the secularism as a concept, or in general the concept of secular state, I would say includes its own exclusions. For me, and the issue has to do with the lack of the neutrality. We need to ask these questions when we explore, when we discuss whether the relationship between a secular state and the freedom of the conscience. The question is, do secular states make laws on the basis of non-controversial premises, values, and ideas? Or is there an escape from values, ideologies, worldviews in politics in Turkey or somewhere else? So is there basically a politics which is not practiced without reference to values, the substantive commitments of the human beings, or the comprehensive doctrines? It's a complex debate. And that debate is actually what I studied during my dissertation, and the question of there can be a neutral state, there can be a liberal neutrality. And my conclusion regarding that is I am skeptical of the possibility of a neutral state. So in my view, there should be always a state which prioritizes, privileges certain values over others. And there's not going to be a state which is neutral towards all conceptions of the good, all conceptions of the good life. In that regard, I don't think that there's an escape from ideologies, values in the in the law-making process of the states, and because of that, I don't see necessarily how secular states deal with the problem that the religious states creates. If the religious states creates problems by violating the freedom of conscience, the liberty of the people, the rights and liberties, similar things may happen under the secular systems too, and not only the French laïcité version of it. We can talk more about this during the question and answer session. Finally, I want to address the issue of the AKP and its relation to secularism, and how, to answer the last question, whether the secularism can travel to a non-Western context, or can it work in a Muslim majority society. To understand that, we need to look at the roots of the AKP, and AKP, as we know, founded by reacting to the Islamism. By rejecting the Islamists, the founders of the AKP were coming from Islamist backgrounds. But when they founded the political party, they say, we don't want to pursue an Islamist discourse in the public sphere, because they said identity politics, and identity politics based on Islamic values creates polarization. It's not a sustainable, it creates polarization in Turkey, and it's not a sustainable position. So hence, they say we are not Islamists. The early years of the AKP began with, you can see in the early years of the AKP, all the politicians proving that they were not Islamists. But at the same time, this is often missed by, I think, the analysts who are writing on Turkey, or analysts who are writing on Turkey. The issue is that AKP did not totally embrace a liberal neutrality position either. AKP defined itself, first of all, as a conservative Democrat party, and in the conservative, in the Turkish context, refers to the values of the religious values of the Turkish citizens of Turkey. So in that regard, in my reading, even though many people see AKP as a post-Islamist political party, as a post-Islamist meaning that Islamists rejecting their Islamic heritage and completely embracing a liberal discourse, that was not the case. So I see AKP as more of a communitarian political party in political theory terminology, a communitarian political party that privileges a certain, privileges religious values, Islamic values in its politics. We can see that in the AKP politicians, in the AKP references to the civilization. For instance, in the Turkish context, the concept of civilization began to be used only during this era of the AKP. Before that, under the Kemalist rule, there was one civilization, and that was Western civilization. But now we talk about Islamic civilization. And this is just a recent development in the Turkish politics, I would say. The AKP initiated the Alliance of the Civilizations Institute, an Alliance of the Civilizations program, and that has to do with this communitarian logic, that we are part of a civilization. So it is a different than a liberal discourse. That in a liberal discourse, it is more individualistic. You have to be neutral towards different worldviews. But when you talk about civilization, your values, your history, you are going beyond the boundaries of the liberalism. And subsequently, we see more references to the civilization, history, and religious values among AKP politicians. Or we can see this with respect to the education policies of the AKP too. Education policies of the AKP is also an example in which you see an emphasis on religion. It is not a liberal way of dealing with the educational issues. Rather adding more classes on religion to the public schools, or promoting the Imam Hatip schools. These are some examples where you see the communitarianism put into practice in the case of AKP. So to go back to the original question, can secularism travel to the Muslim world? I say that, yes, AKP, relatively speaking, the answer is that yes, and partially yes and partially no. AKP is an example of a secularization, is an example of adaptation to the diversity in one sense, compared to the welfare party period. But at the same time, it is and secularism that is transformed and tamed through communitarian ideals and sensibilities. So, and that is how I interpret the AKP experience. And so what? If we ask the question of so what? So overall lessons or points that I would like to emphasize in my presentation are the following. First, I would say that the common defenses of secularism do not stand up to scrutiny, and the terms of the the debate about normative desirability of the secularism should change. And my basic point is that we need to have a more sophisticated discussion about secularism. We need to have a more theoretical-oriented discussion about secularism. And the guiding question for such an initiative should be how secular states address the problems that secularists think religion-based states create. That is, for me, should be a guiding question of a research program in which we problematize the exclusions of the secular state, the potential exclusions, discriminations embedded in any polity and particularly in a secular state. Second lesson or point I would like to draw your attention to is, yes, again, the ruling a diverse society pressures Islamic movements to revise their discourses. And that is the whole point about this comparative politics literature. They talk about inclusion and moderation hypothesis. If you include the Islamist actors and in a diverse society, they have to adjust their discourses in order to win elections. So we can see evidence to support that, but that doesn't mean they wholeheartedly embrace a liberal discourse, a liberal neutrality discourse, a liberal individualistic discourse, which reduces Islam to one narrative among many. So they don't want to go in that direction either. So in my reading, my conclusion is the AKP experience shows the simultaneous limitations of liberalism and Islamism in the case of one Muslim majority society. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And now we move on to Professor Heba Raouf. She's a political scientist and a member of the very institute that Professor Tasgetiren was talking about, the Alliance of Civilizations Institute. And she also is in the political science department of Ibn Khaldun University. She's taught in several places, including Oxford University, University of Westminster, University of California at Berkeley, Georgetown, and Oxford Center for Islamic Studies. And if my notes are correct, her latest book is The Political Imagination of Islamists, a Conceptual Analysis, which was out in 2015. And her talk is entitled Secularism and Reform, How the Muslim Mind Maps Ideas and Trends. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bismillah. Actually, I was very honored to attend today and to attend the conference, but I also was honored to be invited for the past year. And last year I was considering also sort of new horizons of understanding secularism in space, and then I talked about the city, how our cities are more and more secularized, and that we are not noticing because it's becoming part of our day-to-day life. The definition has been pinned in our heads as secularism, separation between religion and politics, but actually the modern secularism has produced a lot of sort of manifestations in different realms, and my concern was at the time last year to think about what is the city, how it can become secularized, secularism manifested in space, and ask ourselves what is an Islamic city. So if this is one of the products of modernity and secularism, how can we then imagine an Islamic city manifestation of the opposite understanding, which is Islam as manifested in space and in this, the city. I'm trying to build on that in this presentation and take the notion of secularism further to different horizons of meaning. And being a political theorist, I've been reflecting a lot about the whole debate about secularism, especially after Charles Taylor's publication of his book, The Age of Secularism, and the debate that it has created, and how we can actually look at these notions from our side. And needless to say that so many concepts that have been introduced by modernity have witnessed substantial change in meaning and manifestation. So the what we mean by a specific word related to modernity has been, the word is still used, but what is inside the word hiding, you know, as a Trojan horse, is so much changing and transforming. So there is a degree of ambiguity. We can stretch the concept to different meanings, and what is more important is that sometimes there is a sort of a paradigm or a frame of reference or an idea that is embedding too many other ideas, like modernity, for example. So what is modernization? Modernization is rationalization, it's industrialization, it's urbanization, and it's secularization, basically, roughly. So sometimes one concept gets opened and then it swallows all other concepts. So instead of considering rationalization to be the beginning or the start, we can see that secularization has taken over as the core concept, but then again changing its nature and taking different faces and different sort of forms. So trying to look at the world we are living in, not only look into the books, maybe one can actually see the manifestations of this taking over of a secular mind. What do we mean by secularism? Depends who we are, how we define it, whether we are talking about intellectual issues, or whether we're talking about philosophy, whether we're talking about epistemology. So I want to say that the core of secularization, but also the core of modernity, was to turn the human being into a god, not only to sort of free him from the religious domination or the religious sovereignty. So creating the sovereign self. And this, the ultimate expression of the sovereign self, due to historical reasons that are not all too good, you know, is the sovereign state. So we have the sovereign self as an imagined sort of manifestation of becoming modern, but eventually this idea, this project, was taken by the Westphalian state, and the so-called representation of the sovereign self was actually the Leviathan, was actually the sovereign state. So here you have sovereignty in relation to the individual theoretically, but basically who took the sovereignty was the sovereign state. And then you can see all the criticism regarding that the sovereign self is not existing anymore on the ground, like citizens are no more free in all the work of Agamben and others, but also that it remained on the imaginary sense a very powerful idea, that the individual should be free, all the discourse on human rights. So this sovereign self remained, but when it comes to politics, it falls apart. The citizenship is for many theories, for many critical perspectives, not actually materialized because of the sovereignty of the state of emergency, and other things that make the individual subject to the sovereignty of the state. This imaginary has been very powerful, and hence I think that we can reorder our understanding of the conceptual systems that we are facing around this notion of homo deus, around this notion of the individual. I'm not referring I'm not referring to the book of Yuval Harari. It's a good book. It's important to read, but I'm not referring to it. I'm taking the concept of that the individual is a sovereign, and that would lead eventually, right from the outstart, one could see that if you put God aside and the state becomes a God, and then you're talking about the sovereign self, eventually the individual will see himself self-controlling the world, and hence he will become the God, the source of judgment in terms. So he will not claim that he is a god, but he will act like a god. He will act without any boundaries of halal, haram, right and wrong, civility according to different cultural definitions, etc. How did we think about secularism in the Arab Muslim world? You know, when you look into the literature on secularism, there are different ways to approach secularism, and we have a huge literature on secularism. So we started thinking about secularism because of historical political reasons. The fall of the Khilafah introduced to us this idea of secularism. Of course, before the fall of Khilafah, there has been in the 19th century debates about Sharia, al-Insan, how can we sort of think about a new world. With the engagement of some of our scholars with Europe, they started thinking. This was there. But the fall of it remained intellectual, but the fall of the Caliphate, the Ottoman Caliphate, basically represented a direct challenge, and people started realizing that the colonial manifestation of secularism, which is colonialism, is very much threatening their way of life. So it became more of a political challenge on the ground, and of course intellectuals started talking about secularism and Islamic politics, and then the notion of the Islamic State. It started, rolling like an ball. So on the second level, there has been literature on secularism from an epistemological perspective, from sort of a philosophical perspective. We have Al-Attas, we have Al-Misiri, and we have Taha Abdul Rahman. Of course, many other voices come in. Ali Izzat Begovic, one can see some of his work as addressing issues of secularism as well, and trying to sort of give credit to the human element and to faith in the life of humans. So we have a lot of literature. And also we have interest in religion as religion practiced in life, so sociology of religion, history of religion, starting from Muhammad Abdullah Draz and on to, you can say, Talal Asad, for example, and interest in the work of Talal Asad and the translation of his work into Arabic. And we also have the one stream of writing and thinking about secularism that was in the disciplines, in the academia, Islamization of knowledge and other. So you have the intellectuals, you have the political concerns and writings, and you have the academia and the disciplines. So, and I always say Islamization of knowledge and beyond, because I consider it to be a phase, and then moving on to widening the notion of how can we reclaim our own understanding of the sciences, can we contribute to the critical theory if we can widen up the notion of a critical theory and introduce also ideas from religious perspectives. And then you had the talk about secularism as ammunition in intellectual wars. So the secularists and the Islamists had in the 80s and 90s rounds of discussions and debates and public debates on secularism and whether it is the best solution to guarantee human dignity in the Arab world. And many of the Islamists thought that this is one of the sort of fronts to fight against that, the very famous debates that took place with Sheikh Ghazali and Sheikh Qaradawi on different occasions in Cairo with secular intellectuals. And then we have the fiqhi front. So secularism is haram, and those who adhere to secular systems and do not apply Sharia are kafir. So there is another level of talking and debating about secularism, which is starting from, I would be very cautious to say that, but starting from the idea of Mufasala, of Sayyid Qutb and his understanding of the worldview that is trying to dominate, etc., to the militant groups and the fatwas, etc. So we can't put them on the same line, but I'm talking about the intellectual, taking it to the space of haram and halal and wrong and right, and not rather the epistemological debate or the ways of thinking and their implications in life. And we have a gap that secularism also manifests itself in a way, if it's homo deus, in science, not only in philosophical and theoretical thinking. Here we have a gap. Of course, we have writings about secularism as manifested in science, specifically how it empowered the scientific research to go into directions to basically sort of achieve this homo deus, the control of the human over his destiny, over the world, over time, over death, and I will come to that later. And this is a gap that Muslims have been tackling. The literature on bioethics is trying to bring into a very secular domain of this is just scientific, has nothing to do with faith or practices in day-to-day life too. No, there is an ethical dimension here, and Muslims have contributed to that. So if we widen a bit the scope in understanding what is secularism and try to see the manifestations of non-tawheed, not the manifestations of tawheed in Farouqi's language, then it would change the way we look at things and which topics we are putting on the table, which will be a huge map actually, but it needs somehow looking into and reflecting. We were very much, for a long time, affected by a geographical imagination. So most of the literature and work on these different tracks was basically, in a subtle way and sometimes in a very clear way, thinking geographically about secularism as coming from the West. So we have not been interested too much in the way religion has to do with life and politics and economics and all the domains of life in other civilizations, but we focused very much on the Western. So this Islam and the West has been the overarching sort of imaginary when we were talking about secularism. There is also the historical imagination, our own experience with colonialism, and there has been also some sort what I call a martial imagination. There is always that, so we have to fight, and of course the colonial era necessitated this framing the issue into the need to struggle, the need to fight against colonialism, and all the modern origins of the project of colonialism. But this state, this spirit of fighting, was there more than the spirit of how can we deal with these issues in a more futuristic way, not to wait for the action to take a reaction, but rather to look forward. And also it was very much related to some sort of a moral imagination. So not to be secular takes forms that you can see visibly, the hijab, for example. Even though in many situations people who adhere or claim to adhere to an Islamic perspective and the form looks Islamic, their attitudes are very liberal or liberalist. So policies of some Islamic parties have been neoliberal. So the form and the essence, this is also a topic. So focusing only on the moralist sort of dimensions without taking into, bearing in mind the other dimensions. Parallel to that sort of confusion in trying to tackle secularism, the different tracks of understanding secularism, their different levels, they're being informed by different notions of authority, whether it's ilm authority or whether it's political authority. We have had all that literature regarding reform ijtihad in terms of politics, specifically the very narrow definition of secularism. So we have been witnessing parties that previously said political parties are haram, moving to political parties are okay, and Islam and democracy, Islam and liberalism. So even on the very political strict level, there has been so much going on parallel to the production of literature on secularism as secularism. So this should be taken into consideration when one is looking at the whole picture of, let's say, the last 100 years or so. What is changing now is that the speed of the manifestations and crystallization of new types of secularism, new types of understanding the world from the homo deus perspective, that the human being is the one in charge and God and spirituality are outside that realm. It's not only separation, but it's also basically exclusion. And taking into hand basic sort of to say functions of God. Like, for example, changing the nature of the human self, changing the nature of the human body, changing the nature of the human action, changing the nature of human ethics. Everything is transforming in a way that if you stand and say, hey, but this is, they say, oh, you're going to resort to a religious discourse? No, this is not acceptable. And what is possible is permissible. Al-mutah, mubah. So science comes here, and different innovations and techniques that are being more and more accessible to wider audience are penetrating our life, and we don't see that these are seculars. This is a manifestation of the control of time and space and the self. Between the machine and the animal, so the technical and the animality, we see the human self being redefined. And this is what they call now sort of the post-human age. So if you want to define, you cannot have a commitment to a religious perspective without a definition of the human as a creation of God. And now in the age of homo deus, because of secularism and the long history of secularism, we are witnessing the change of the human nature itself. For good reasons, with good slogans like we have to save lives, we have to do this and that, stem cells research, for example. There is now a lot of research done on growing human organs in the laboratories. We are talking about a change and interference in genetics and saving embryos, for example, from carrying diseases of the family that run in the family. So it looks good, but at the end of the day, it's also transforming a lot of the human essence along the way. And the religious discourse is barely being able to follow the very speedy changes going on. And when it does, there is little said about whether, and it's not only about haram and halal, it's also about that people understand what this represents. And sometimes the religious discourse should be paralleled with a humanist discourse, because basically I think that we have so many people around the world who are very concerned about changing the individual body from the nature that we know. But in an age of postmodern thinking, there is no such thing as the essence. So what do you mean by the essence of the human body? And to understand that this all refers to the secular mind and the homo deus assumption, I would give a very interesting example. For example, dealing with the body, dealing with death. There is an exhibition that has been running in the world since 2005. It's called Body Worlds. And it's about basically exhibition of dead bodies. And I read about that exhibition with quite horror, you know. What is the idea? There is a doctor that invented a way to basically keep the body so that it will not witness decay by something called plastination. So on one hand, it preserves the body, like the old pharaohs used to do, but it's not in that form that it changes. It's not, اسمه إيه اللي بيحفظوا بيه الجثث? Formalin, yeah, it's not keeping them with that. But basically, by a degree of plastinization, they take off the skin, and the body is in front of you, and you can see the organs. And they take these bodies that have been donated with free will by the person. Okay, and they put them in exhibitions. You can Google body worlds, and for me, this is, they say the person who died, the body belongs to someone who said he's okay with this exhibition. So you see all these bodies in the exhibition without the skin. You can see the organs, you can see the muscles and everything, and not only that, but they are also. There is a theatrical dimension. They're putting them in a way like a football player, for example, or two sitting next to each other, cuddling, or, you know, and these are dead bodies. And if you face this is like giving the person the right to, it's all about the human right that the person agrees, who owned the body, basically. And the idea is horrific. There was Catholic debates about whether this is acceptable or not, and whether children should be watching something like that or not, whether it's like a medical, specialized thing, or it's open for the public. And people started talking about, no, actually our children are enjoying it. It's almost like the Natural History Museum, you know, they're watching in front of them, you know, the human body. And what struck me is that this world exhibition that has been going from one city to the other performed here in Istanbul. And I don't know whether there has been debate about that, but this is what John Gray talks about as the mission of defeating death. Stem cells research has a mission also of trying as much as they can to defeat death. You will be able in the course of time to change organs in your body from your stem cells, create new ones, and also the skin. So it's interesting how we are witnessing a manifestation of homo deus as the core of the idea of secularism far beyond politics. And I think that we can try to address that, and I have like keywords for what I wanted to say, because there is not much time. I say from tahrim to ta'lim. Yani from saying this is haram or halal to looking into the matters and the manifestations and the speedy way of the expression of this idea of the homo deus, that human beings can control everything, in a way that would educate people, and turning it from an intellectual debate to a way to address the public about choices. Because in either there is a way that we can deal with that legally, but what is more dangerous is that people start accepting these ways of life, capital L and I and F and E, in a way that makes religion irrelevant to such changes that are taking place. Of course, also technology come in. I had it on my list of topics, you know. Do we talk about we talk about bioethics? Do we talk about technoethics? Do people say, it's okay, it's fine, it's interesting that you use this device, but from a humanist, religious, wider spiritual perspective, there are ethics to deal with devices as much as there are ethics to deal with people. And do we contribute to that debate that is taking place in the world, not only about copyrights and about the use of technology and which age, or no, about our relation with the machine, because the machines are being implanted in our own bodies in more and more in medicine, but also they are becoming like an extension of our bodies. We walk now with our mobiles, you know, so it's like somehow an extension of the body, and then through it you reach to the world as a medium, but this also affects your way of defining yourself as a human, and also ethics and morality and duties and many other things. These debates needs to be widely put under a new theory of secularism that is not over-politicized, which was the case over the last 100 years or so. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Do you have a question already? Okay. Can I just sum up just very shortly, and then we'll... No, can I first sum up, and then you can ask your question? It's very interesting to me that the first two talks started off sort of defining secularism in a kind of, well, introducing us to moments where secularism seemed very fragile, and I was sort of listening to the verbs used, things like democracy defending itself and secularism being betrayed. So I was hearing a lot of fragility, but then Professor Heba, she kind of gave back its rights, almost sort of this kind of very robust secularism that can lead the way. So I really like the kind of contrast there, which I'm sure questions will explore. So yes, please, on to you. Do we have a mic, roaming mic? Yes, over here.
It's on.
Thank you very much. In fact, it is not a question. It is my point of view on Islam, on word Islamization used by the speakers. I am very much skeptical. I have written to save the time. I am very much skeptical about the word Islamization. It is an old, confused word. Came in existence in 80s, rather we can say it Islamic perception of knowledge, manifesting extension of knowledge, understanding of the new challenges, comparative assimilation. For example, the great works done by Farabi, Kindi, Averroes and other Muslim philosophers and scientists in the medieval period in the area of philosophy and science were not Islamization. In fact, it was not Islamization, but in fact it was extension of knowledge with Islamic perception and discourses.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for keeping it brief. Does anybody want to respond to that?
I said we are going beyond Islamization. I said that it was a starting point for a generation that was challenged by all others, that we have nothing, Islam has nothing to introduce. So our professors were the 60s generation, etc. And the generation of the 70s and 80s started thinking about that. And then they went beyond it. So we are not thinking in these terms anyway, like taking everything on our sort of table, but rather thinking and then throwing our ideas and also contributing to critical thinking about the world and also movement, because we have to act accordingly.
Sorry. Yes, Tommy. Oh, okay, fine. All right, that's how we do it then. Okay. Yes, can we have the question, please? Yes.
Yes. Thank you for all the presenters. I think it's one question, but can be answered by any of the presenters. Firstly, I think that in the case of AKP, which has been limiting the liberalism and Islamism and using secularism as a tool of power in Turkey, while otherwise, on the contrary, what happens in France is how the Christians are using the secularism as a tool of power, and that was what happened in the previous period. What's your opinion on how far will it go how far will secularism be protected in preserving power? And is secularism is just a tool, a transition tool, to create a void before another faith or another religion come up to replace the secularism? Thank you.
Okay. There's some over here.
I have a question for Heba, and thank you all for addressing this very complicated term, secularism. And I do appreciate that really you tried in your presentation to reflect the complexity of the concept itself. But I have a comment I would like to get your response to it. You know, I fear that trying to address some of those issues arising out of technology and out of a new capacity that you have as a human being because of science, through a meta-narrative might be a bit uncalled for. You know, let me put it this way. I don't want to use more dramatic terms. Because I feel that we don't have really to take the opposite. You know, if the secular world brought man into the center, then our mission would be to take man from the center, or the human being, just not to be, you know, human being from the center to the margin again. Because we have to also remember, as you know, I, as a believer in Revelation myself, I think the one who put man into the center of the universe is Allah, is God. You know, because He said in the Quran that He has made the whole creation subordinate and gave the human being, of course, we are moral agents. So we have to abide by certain values that are human values, but they are also revealed, I mean, affirmed values through revelation. So I guess we don't really have to take man from the center to counter secularism. Though I agree with you, we have to debate and look into those issues that affecting humanity and their attitudes and their behavior. But I don't feel we need to use a meta-narrative. This is my question to you, if you'd like to address, you know, this issue.
More questions over there? Over here? Oh, okay.
Thank you very much. I have a question to Francois. I wonder how the secular scholars in France address the following contradiction. I understand, of course, when you know, how the secularists reacted to the coalition between the monarchy and the church, you know, oppressing people and doing all that. Now, how do they respond to the fact that a military rule like the one in Egypt, which is an autocracy, this is an autocratic regime that is doing exactly the same that was done before. How can this be justified to be supported in front of a democratic or semi-democratic system that emerged after the 2011 revolution in Egypt? Thank you.
Over here?
Yes. Hello? Hello, is this working? Hi, thank you. This is a question specifically for Dr. Tasgetiren. I was wondering, you mentioned about the theorization of secularism in Turkey as, I think you said, a precondition of democracy in the Turkish case. I was wondering if I could maybe connect this back to a statement made yesterday by Halil Burgat, when he talks about religion as a kind of precondition for the efficacy of nationalism in the Turkish case, as a way of rooting a kind of national sentiment. And it produces an interesting, I don't know if we want to call it a paradox, maybe an aporia, in which secularism and religion are in some kind of relationship that isn't simply the overcoming of one by the other. And so I'm wondering if in this case we can think about the way secularism as a process, as a project, has tried to displace religion into the realm of values, and whether once religion becomes particularly something of civilization or history of a realm of values, whether the current Turkish government's attempt to revitalize the tradition is not already taking place within a space delimited by the secular or delimited by secularism. That's my first question. The second is a kind of just of interest. You talk about the enshrining of secularism in the Constitution in 1937, but I'm wondering what happened prior to 1937 and the Turkish Republic's attempt to theorize the relationship between religion and secularism. What other options were on the table but perhaps not pursued before that? Thank you.
Any more questions? Any more? Anything? Okay, maybe one last here, the gentleman over here.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Really, first I'd like to thank all the speakers about their talks, and then I'd like to just comment. It's not just a question. If I'd like to think about secularism, and I'd like to come to my mind a sentence in one of the very famous movies called the Jurassic Park. It has been produced 1993, something like that. One of the actors in the movie, when he saw the dinosaurs in the Jurassic Park, he said, God create man. No, first, God create dinosaurs. God create man. Man destroy dinosaurs. Man destroy God. Man create dinosaurs. This sentence, as I think, Wallah Alam, is, this is the main point of this issue about secularism. And if we go back, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created man, He said, إِنِّي جَاعِلٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً. The angels, I'm going to make a representative on earth. And the angels replied to him, how come you are going to put this kind of human being, they are going to kill each other and so on. And he said, subhanahu wa ta'ala, I know what you don't know. And he teach Adam, and he let him know the names. And these make the human being different by the mind. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He put a mind in the human being, different than all the creations. So the human being, now as Dr. Heba said about defeating death, the man trying to use his mind to do whatever he can do to make him as God subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he has, of course, many challenges. He's trying and trying and trying. So I believe, Allah Alam, this is the idea of secularism and all of these issues. Especially when you are talking about Muslim Ummah, this kind of issues is kind to make us as a Muslims not challenging, but it's just a kind of make us busy about replying or responding to this kind of issues, which is not helping us as a Muslims and Muslim Ummah, but in the other side it is we are losing time and we're losing some effort and so on. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Now on to the speakers. Oh, you've got one more, okay.
Can we perhaps take some kind of a route that might be not so much philosophical and come to the reality that affects me as a man in the street? Perhaps looking at leaving aside the sovereignty of man and the philosophical aspect of secularism, and take secularism as a form of either political system or practical day-to-day action in a form of rationalism rather than really secularism. I would like to take as an example Islamic finance. And in Islamic finance, we have a set of rules. These rules, we discuss them, we argue them, we think that they are good for humanities. And then the whole issue becomes always applying these rules. We don't care with Muslim or with non-Muslim, who gives it, who takes it, all that. So it has no religious face so to speak, although it is called Islamic finance, but in fact it has no religious face. Now, like what sometime maybe an ancestor of Francois Burgat said something, Jacques Burke, that Islam itself is a kind of secular religion, because we deal with set of rules all the time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is that all? Okay. Now we can move on to the speakers. I think we still have time, so you can take about 5 minutes to answer the questions that were directed to you, or the in general sort of the comments that have been raised. Please.
When it comes to the shortcuts I took this morning addressing the issue of secularism in the limits of the reactive position of ruling elites in France, I must adapt my problematic and say that, of course, secularism, in my opinion, keeps being a goal that most societies more or less must achieve, especially in a multicultural world. Sometimes when I hear the sound like, we might have heard something like this morning, you know, my religion is divine, yours are man-made. I say to my Muslim colleagues, what about traveling to Indonesia, and you will face the 2 billion of Chinese on top of your head, and will you start the discussion by saying, my religion is the good one, the others do not exist? No, there has to be a common denominator beyond the primary belongings to be elaborated, and this more or less is secularism. So the fact that I have denounced the instrumentalization of secularism by the French authorities do not mean that I've moved away from this, must. The attitude of the ruling elites in France are no longer rational. In the field of human rights, in the field of democracy, it is so easy. 2 weeks ago, I put a sentence. I was in Turkey, and I said, beware, I'm going to tell you something. It sounds nice to you Turks, but it is not. From a French point of view, the rights of a Turkish citizen are worth more than the rights of an Egyptian citizen. What did I mean? If you say Turkey, at least in part of the ruling elites in France, you hear human rights. If you say Egypt, you say, good customer, nice person, let's have our next deal. So there is no rationality, there is no respect of the principles in the attitude. Let me wrap up the attitude of France facing the Arab Spring. Beginning of the Arab Spring, we said to Zine al-Abidin Ben Ali, we'll help you, we'll get you, better tools to handle the situation. And we said the same to Mubarak, we'll help you have a more efficient repression. Then we said, mistake. We moved away in the totally opposite direction, and we handled the situation in Libya on this extreme way, military intervention, allowing us the right to assassinate the head of state, more or less, okay? And then what happened to our principles of freedom and democracy and human rights? We realized, the ruling elite in France started realizing that in the ballot boxes of this part of the world, if there were free elections, the color of the political elite emerging would not be of the brand which we like. More or less it would be the Islamic trend. And all of a sudden we didn't say it, but we started changing completely our understanding of the Syrian crisis. So, yeah, I'm afraid this is not so easy. Now, again, just a sentence when it comes to secularism and the contradictions between a Muslim understanding and a non-Muslim understanding of this principle. From a non-Muslim point of view, I have long ago, 25 years ago, been advocating the fact that between the so-called supremacy of the divine law, which would be your identity as Muslim, and our identity, supremacy of the people's law, there are bridges. Because, in fact, I'd let you address the Muslim side of the situation, but from a non-Muslim point of view, the so-called supremacy of human law is not unlimited. We have long admitted that if we were a parliament and we decide that every people who have no hair like me will be executed tomorrow, I will desperately look for principles to oppose the human will. And I will say, oh, I'm sorry, there are principles above your will, above the human will. Okay? Where are they? Principes généraux du droit, we say in French, general principle of law. We have to admit the fact that there is a bunch of principles which are out of reach of human will. More or less, we see that with divine law above human will and principes généraux du droit above human will, we have a common denominator. So this is why I do not consider that our understanding of secularism in a Muslim perspective and a non-Muslim perspective is so strictly divided.
Can I sort of remind you of maybe the first question about, I don't know whether you've got anything to say, but secularism as power, used as power by Christians in France. I think sort of more or less this was what was being asked, how secularism is sort of instrumentalized by Christians.
We are moving in the bad direction, and I'm very pessimist.
Okay, okay. Okay, Professor Tasgetiren, yeah.
Regarding the question about AKP's relationship to secularism, again, I would say it's a complex issue. It's just, I wouldn't say AKP wants to totally change the whole system and come up with a different system. I wouldn't say that. And certain things that I think we need to, if we put it into the Turkish historical context, certain things that AKP has been doing also done by the previous center-right parties in Turkey. That is something, if you contextualize what happened, like Imam Hatip schools, for instance, people often say, from secularist perspective, AKP opened so many Imam Hatip schools and you can talk about religionization of the education. But Imam Hatip schools, they were first opened by, in 1950s by Democrat Party, and Adnan Menderes was not an Islamist. Or later by Süleyman Demirel was not an Islamist, he's a center-right politician. So the issue for me is that part of the issue about these religious politics has to do with accommodating the demands. And I agree with those points of view who say that and religionization, the more impact of the religion we see in the politics has to do with, to some extent, democratization of the Turkey. That is how I would respond to that question. But still, as I said, I think AKP politicians still concerned and aware of the issue about like how to rule a diverse society. That is the first one that led to the debates and they are distancing themselves from Islamism. But it's some sort of a middle way between neither a complete liberal perspective, a liberal version of secularism, neither a Kemalist version of secularism, somewhere in between. And it can be maybe explored as a model in and of itself. It can say something about how Muslims negotiate these different ideas in a Muslim majority society. Regarding your questions, it is true that religion is used for nationalism, for nationalist purpose, and secularists employ religion instrumentally. And that, again, it has to do with Turkey's own secular system, which has a presidency of religious affairs. And Kemalist state also used that to promote ideas about like obedience to the state, loyalty to the state, unity of the citizens, things like that. And there's a literature about how secularism instrumentally uses the presence of religious affairs in Turkey to achieve what they want to achieve. Or another example might be the required religion and ethics courses in Turkey. They were introduced after the 1980 coup by Kenan Evren. And he was not an Islamist, obviously. He was a defender of Kemalist perspective. So, and that points out to another problem in secularism, which is, I think, the issue of the secular ethics. The Turkey has a secular ethics, widespread, commonly shared secular ethics. If no, then the secular state even instrumentally has to use religion to achieve certain purposes on their own terms. Other question about what other options were available before 1937. I mean, all these secularist policies were implemented, applied during the early years of the early 1920s. And the debate about secularism goes back to the second constitutional period in Ottoman Empire. And yeah, historians and anyone who studied Turkey is well aware that and Westernism in the early republic received their ideas from the late 19th century Ottoman Empire. All these translations from the Western countries regarding materialism, positivism, scientism, etc. But the mindset was there. I think in the early years of the republic there was this Westernist orientation, and all the major reforms, abolition of the caliphate, the language reform, the change of the laws about marriage, divorce, and etc., they all took place during the early years. And your final point, which is, I think, a very interesting point you draw our attention to, which is just use of these maybe paying lip service to civilization, all these community ideas, is maybe a part of secularization. This is what you are asking, and maybe yes. Maybe the answer is maybe the secular state, and you lower your standards, in a sense, if you are coming from a more like critical background, religious background regarding the secular state. You are just employing certain terminology, a communitarian terminology, concepts, but doesn't really question other things. Someone may make such a point, and actually sometimes, you know, Sheriff Mardin, for instance, he said that AKP is the victory of secularism in Turkey. So, thank you.
All right, thank you. Professor Heba?
Thank you. I think that your point is very valid, but I didn't suggest that we would take the human being from the center of our interest, but rather I'm concerned about replacing him with a robot. You know, the European Union is now discussing giving personhood to robots. So they will be as equal as you are in the future public sphere. And you will not be able to control them, and you'll not be able to get rid of them. They will be self-generating their own systems, and eventually, if robots are given personhood in Europe within a few years, if this works out, and it's possible, by the way, getting rid of a robot or defunctioning him can be considered like killing. So what comes out of that, or replacing the human with massive massacres. The tools would be drones and mercenaries that are now taking wars and privatizing them. You know, the head of the Blackwater, the person who founded Blackwater is asking for privatization of war in Afghanistan. Just give us these cases and we will get rid of it. So what I'm saying is not that we want to take the human being from the center and throw him away. Because God is not in the center in the Islamic perspective. God is above the whole paradigm. The other thing related to whether these theoretical issues have nothing to do with people's lives, of course, from an Islamic finance perspective and from an economist perspective, these philosophical considerations might be trivial and non-important, but from a sociological perspective, they are highly important. If you define the human, and if you see it challenged by the animality, the dinosaurs that have been mentioned, and by violation of the basic integrity of the human body, the human self, it has manifestations in life. I don't want to die in a country that considers my sovereign self to be a property of the sovereign state, and I have no right to ask even that I am buried in full body. So automatically when I'm dead, I'm considered to be spare parts for other people without my consent. So the very theoretical is very much related to the very to the very practical, especially if we come to issues like technology and the use of different devices to monitor people. They are very good when they unveil a crime like killing someone like Jamal Khashoggi, but they are very unuseful when they are used to monitor your face in the public sphere and chasing you and violating your privacy. So it's a long issue to discuss and debate on different levels, and I think I've just been attempting to open some of the issues that might be relevant to that discussion. Thank you.
Okay, are you done? Go ahead.
Over to Professor Ayad.
Oh, well, okay, we're finishing early, which is rare, unless somebody has questions or comments that you would like to have. Okay, Professor Masad, can we have the microphone, please? Right here in the back, here in the front.
Thank you. Dr. Heba, this is for you. I'm still not sure what you're trying to get at. Generally in the West, at least in Europe since the Enlightenment, science is produced and articulated ideologically as the replacement of religion. It is its own religious system. From historians and philosophers of science, we have now an understanding of how science develops, the kind of revolutions, of paradigmatic shifts that happen in it from Thomas Kuhn onwards. So we have a better understanding of the theoretical and philosophical underpinnings of something like science as a parallel or a replacement for the concept of religion in the West. So it has its own ethics in that way. So you've expressed a lot of worries about technological transformations, about the transformation of the human into a cyborg, etc. But I'm still not sure what the argument is. I mean, is this an attempt to say, well, I mean, your worries are shared by people who are secular about the ethical aspects of this. So I'm not really sure where you're anchoring your angle of critique of the surveillance state, of the technologization of the human body, etc. So I'm still unclear, and I would like you to clarify.
What I'm saying that our discourse on secularism so far has not integrated such topics into the discussion and have not been making them sort of open to the public so that people relate them to their day-to-day life. So when we talk about secularism, it's still, discourse is highly politicized in content and politicized in context. And what I say is not new, as you said. Science has been, taking its own steps towards this control over the body and developing and challenging death and challenging, many things that the human being is facing. But this has not been part and parcel of our discussion of secularism, and I wanted to open, or what I call networking debates, that these debates have been encapsulated in their own limitations, and I want to open the debate so that the future of the Arab and Muslim mind would actually bring these debates together, because this will substantially transform our discussion of secularism and bring them to new horizons. This is it.
Very well, thank you very much. These sessions raise sometimes more questions than they give answers, but that's the start of a conversation, especially in an important topic as such. There are a lot going on across the Muslim world, and the issue of secularism and the different versions of secularism and the levels of secularism. We see, part of it in Morocco now, and how they have been trying to change the notion of secularism. We have seen, as Dr. Tasgetiren talked about, another version in Turkey, and we'll continue to see these versions, and I think it's important that we engage in such discussions, and I encourage any young scholars in this audience and beyond, those who are probably listening to this on the cyberspace, is to get engaged and send us some of your work, and we'll be more than happy in the center to engage you and to send them to refereed and publish them. Lastly, we would like to give certificates to our distinguished speakers. Our first one is Francois Burgat. Next is Omer. Nagihan. All right, our next session is at 3:10. So please be here at 3 o'clock. We'll start sharply at 3:10. The next session is the role of religion. We'll have also three distinguished speakers, Joseph Lombard, Jonathan Brown, and Lois Hafi.